we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you're watching on YouTube, please hit that bell. Subscribe to our channel, and so you know when our next videos are going to come out. Wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star review. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it really means a lot to us. Please share our podcast with anyone if you ever wanted to reach out to us and let us know any topics, or let us know how we're doing. Check us out on our Twitter at the Bigmark Podcast, or at on our Instagram at the Bigmark Pod. And yeah, like I said, if you share it with one friend, we can double the podcast listenership overnight. So, but again, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for clicking. Again, it's Marky Algorithms today. I'm on the scene like Jim Beam, talking about Stranger Things, baby. Really interesting show. It's sweeping the world, the nation, whatever you want to call it, the streaming space. It's a really interesting thing. I kind of don't want to go too much into major plot details, just in case anyone hasn't seen the show ever and they're just checking things out. Or if you are a big fan, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. Obviously, spoilery alerts for anyone listening who doesn't want to hear anything that they don't want to hear. Maybe stop right now and go watch the entire series and then come back, because I know you're going to remember me after that. No. But like I said, it's really interesting. And with the next half of the show coming out July 1st, which will be a couple days after this podcast airs, like I said, hopefully I can kind of jump on the bandwagon, just as the Duffer Brothers, the creators of the show, have jumped on the nostalgia bandwagon. And, it's kind of interesting. As a kid, as the child of the 90s and growing up throughout the 90s, there was a lot of movies that really romanticized the 60s. I was going to say nostalgized, but again, romanticized and looked back on the 60s as, oh, this was a better time, or there's lessons, and there are people alive at this point that maybe we should look back and maybe we can learn some lessons, or I don't know, maybe I have some more theories about that. But essentially, the same difference between the 60s and the 90s is the same difference between the 80s and today. If anything, it's like the 90s and today more so. But it seems lately we really like to nostalgize the 80s. And maybe it kind of comes from people like myself, who would have been born 1991, early 90s. I never lived in the 80s, obviously. So maybe, now that I'm grown up, I might look back at that time and be like, oh, wow, that was cool. Or, if I was potentially a filmmaker, I could make something about the early 90s or the 90s and be like, I was a child back then, so I kind of remember what was going on. So maybe these filmmakers now, who were children back in the 80s, are now trying to, kind of bring these things back. It's really interesting. It's kind of funny. The times are fitting. Top Gun's the number one movie in the box office. The number one show on TV is about the 80s, and abortion is legal again. So it seems like we're taking major steps back, not only in art, but in life. And, I was talking to my buddy Ryan at work today. Shout out Ryan. What up, brother? And we were kind of saying, it's interesting when, art kind of imitates life and life imitates art, where, there's all these movies about back in the 80s about like fighting the enemy of Russia. And it became something that was on so many people's minds, with the Cold War and everything, that it was almost played out in movies and television, and that was almost the battlegrounds, and that was a place. It was pop culture, and it was everything. It wasn't necessarily on the battlefront. It was in movies, and just trying to create little weird wins, even in an imaginary, quote unquote imaginary realm, and then all of a sudden kind of bring that into reality somehow, right? It's funny, like, for example, a lot of like technology that we see today. So for instance, iTunes, the program iTunes, Apple Music now. But when the guy who programmed iTunes for the first time, he actually got the idea from a Star Trek episode. And it's weird because it's like, so the writer, and if it's Gene Roddenberry, shout out because he wrote it in a book somewhere, but whoever wrote that scene where I think it's Data, one of the characters from Star Trek, sitting in a room and he says, "Computer, play me Beethoven's Ninth Symphony." And in the 90s or whenever when that show came out, that blew people away. You know, at the time, the best you could do is like, you know, you had a remote for like your CD player or whatever, right? So you could like, you know, you didn't have to get up, but to be able to use voice control and just pick up any song you want, and not have to go and put a CD in, or even at any point load up a CD. I remember having, or not personally, but I remember seeing these like at Future Shop and shit where it was like a boombox and then there was like a carousel of like 100 discs. You didn't even have to load that thing. You could just pick it from the library in your music and then boom, hit play, and it's playing beautiful high fidelity tunes, right? So that essentially came from Star Trek. Where that original idea for the writer who wrote that, where that idea came from, again, who knows? And what are ideas? Do ideas actually, you know, they're not something you can hold, obviously, but where do they come from? Do they come from somewhere in the human mind? There's a base and there's somewhere, some organ or some part of the human brain, the way the electrical signals work and chemical reactions, boom, an idea is created. Or do ideas exist on their own and somehow we become, as humans, we become open channels to them. And when we're in the right mindset, these ideas become available to us, right? You know, there's eureka moments and there's ideas that come to you in a flash of light. So where did those come from, right? So again, it's interesting with everything that's happening in the political sphere and everything that's happening in the world today, and how much we are still romanticizing this stuff, and it's nostalgic. And has that even brought us back? Has that brought things into reality in a way? Again, not to say that there's people making decisions to go to war because of TV shows, but just part of the general zeitgeist and the idea, like, we're romanticizing this time period. Oh, cool. It looks cool. Everyone's dressed awesome. The cars look different. And then are we politically romanticizing some of those ideas, going, wow, we had things figured out back in the day and before a lot of these laws that we brought into place, blah, blah, blah. So it's really, it's definitely concerning. Let's just put it that way. The reason why I kind of wanted to do this show and not really go too deep into the plot of the show, with still kind of keeping things interesting in a way, is, again, I really enjoy the overall feel of the show. You know, there's really cool storylines, and again, if you've never seen the show, please go watch it. And again, there's really cool storylines that feel fresh and feel original, even though they are paying homage to a lot of different, you know, old movie and TV tropes. But again, it's a really, really interesting feel. It's kind of like Goonies meets Stand By Me meets like MK Ultra or something. I don't know. It's a really, really cool use of style. And again, a really cool use of callbacks that, especially in the first season, again, it's always funny when you go watch a show, and so for everyone who doesn't know, it's going into it's currently, the show Stranger Things is currently in its 4th season. It's about to finish off in its last season. It's kind of did like a kind of a Sopranos thing where they released the first half of the season so people can kind of binge it. And then I think what they're going to do starting July 1st is they're going to kind of release weekly shows, from what I've heard. Now that's kind of a cool thing. Like I said, Sopranos did it, but again, kind of more of a way to kind of capture, you know, the audience and then get everyone hooked in and leave everyone in a great way. Because again, it's the last season, so there's going to be a lot of tying up of loose ends, so to speak. Like I said, you know, I think it's a really, really interesting and fresh show. There's unique approaches whilst still, you know, paying, you know, homage and paying the dues to, you know, cool movies of old and crime movies and sci-fi, really cool sci-fi stuff. And it's interesting. Again, the that whole MK Ultra thing, like there's that sci-fi aspect to it and everything that they're doing like with those kids. And it reminds me, and I actually, funny enough, listened to a podcast about it, a podcast called Conspiracy Theories on Spotify. Super good if you want to check it out. They talked about the Montauk Project, which is actually a series of U.S. government projects conducted at Camp Hero in Montauk, New York. And it was like psychological warfare stuff, time travel, and it was all done on children. And again, I read in some of my research that Stranger Things was originally going to be called Montauk, and then they kind of changed their mind. But again, it's interesting looking into the project. A lot of people say that it's been completely made up, and it's just like people are having like false memories of it, and they're saying like that they were part of it, but like that's is that repressed memories, or that kind of sounds like a cover up to me. Now, like I said, the creators of the show, the Duffer Brothers, super cool there. It's their first really big hit. They've done a bunch of other shows and stuff, but again, clearly, they care about, tradition and legacy of TV shows while still keeping things really fresh. And I think one of the biggest things they do is with the cast. I think the cast is tremendous. I think all the actors are fantastic. Winona Ryder as Joyce is tremendous. Haven't seen her in a lot lately, so it's a great, she's on a great comeback trajectory there. She's doing an awesome job as Will's mom there. David Harper as Hopper. David Harbour. My bad. David Harbour as Hopper. Tremendous guy. I really, really like him in this character. I think he's been doing really well. To be truthfully honest, I haven't seen him in the new Hellboy, but I saw him in Black Widow, and I thought he was really good. But again, I think he's just done a fantastic job, and he's one of many that I think, we're starting to kind of appreciate that natural kind of rugged, more, natural beauty in any person, whether it's a man or a woman in this show. I think everyone has really interesting looks. The casting was really cool, where I think, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I think people are starting to kind of get away from that whole like super like perfect look with all the plastic surgery and everything, because it looks too perfect, and people can kind of tell, when you look that way, you probably had a little bit of work done, right? So like, I think, it's become uninteresting in a sense. Not that it's still not objectively beautiful and whatever, but I think, a show like this that has interesting plot lines, interesting setting, interesting story, having interesting characters and interesting looking characters, I think, or actors to play them, I think is really cool. Millie Bobby Brown playing Eleven is tremendous. Finn Wolfhard as Mike. Caleb McLaughlin as Lucas. Gaten Matarazzo as Dustin. Again, all the kids are so good in the show, especially in the first few seasons. Like, you watch them and you're like, man, these kids are killer actors. Like, they're crushing it. It's so fantastic. Natalia Dyer as Nancy, who is Mike's older sister, which is really cool, because it's kind of like this, the way that they bring that in. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the show Freaks and Geeks. I think it's a really interesting play on that, where in Freaks and Geeks, as well as Stranger Things, they kind of go into this, older brother, younger brother, or older sibling, younger sibling kind of thing, where, maybe there's a few differences in between you, a few years in between you, like a few years difference. And, maybe one brother or one sibling hangs out with a different crowd, and maybe one sister or the younger kid, hangs out with someone completely different, or they don't even go to the same school or whatever. And, then in other seasons, there's like stepbrother and half sister and all kinds of weird, plays and plot lines with that. And I think it's super cool, and it's supernatural. It's not supernatural, but it has that very natural feel where, again, it's like, the way we grow up and the way we think of things, that nostalgia comes from that. Again, I've mentioned it before on the show. Nostalgia it comes from the Greek word for the pain from an old wound, right? So, even things that, hopefully would make you happy thinking about your siblings and stuff. In the show, there's a lot of, heavier kind of moments where, again, there's not always congruency with siblings, but then at the same time, there's times where everyone gets together and those different age groups kind of coalesce and they all work together. And again, it's so simple, but those moments were huge when you're a kid. Those moments where, whether you were the younger kid and you're like, wow, I get to do something with the older kids, or I get to finally hang out with my brother's friends or my sister's friends or whatever. And then as the older kid being like, wow, I actually have an influence on some of these kids and they're listening to me and we can get along. They're not just some weirdo kids that I don't get along. And, with Joe Keery as Steve Harrington and Charlie Heaton as Jonathan, and of course Noah Schnapp as Will, who's one of the other kids, of course. But again, with the older group and them all getting together, with Steve Harrington specifically is an interesting character because in the show they almost wrote him off of the first season. And he's super jock, bully kind of dude, whatever, right? And most of the rest of the crew are kind of like nerds, right? They're into D&D. Again, in essence, the entire show kind of revolves around D&D, which is very, very cool. Shout out Zach Angus. But it's this one thing where it's like, the jock kind of entering the nerd's lair, right? The tables are kind of turned, where in the past, obviously, the jocks were kind of beating on the nerd and all that kind of stuff, right? Which we've railed against as a society, and we're not down with bullies and everything. But again, as things move, we've almost completely flipped things on its head, where now the jocks and the bullies are the new nerds, and the nerds get to say, fuck you bullies, you guys suck. And that's just kind of generally accepted now, which I don't think is fair either. And we need to move back to a place where things are more even, and we can laugh at each other, but no one should bully each other and whatever, obviously. But again, I definitely relate to that kind of character of feeling in between both worlds. And in the newest season, Lucas's storyline is perfect, spot on for that, where he's starting to, again, the characters are starting to age, which I'll get to that in 1 second, but with their age and with their kind of transitional period, this is probably the only thing I'll really get specific. Lucas is really getting into the basketball team and really wanting to play and really wanting to fit in with the boys and the jocks. And there's a lot of moments where you can tell, and it's really well done. And Caleb McLaughlin does an awesome job acting it out. But this struggle that Lucas has with, does he stick with his friends who unfortunately are nerds, or does he stick with his basketball and his teammates and his new friends that he wants to something's compelling him to want to fit in. And maybe it's just that, but again, really cool repartee, or sorry, not necessarily repartee, I guess there's some of that, but a really cool approach to that whole idea of friend groups don't always get along. So when you're stuck in between them, it's weird, right? And again, I can speak from experience. It's one of those things where there's a lot of preconceived notions that happen, right? And a lot of people think, this is how this person is, and I don't want to have anything to do with them. Or all those people are into weird shit that I don't get. I'm not down. Even all the music shit I did, like a lot of people just didn't really understand it, and then they just said, I don't want to have anything to do with those freak shows. So again, that's an easy thing, let alone like other hardo fucking, groups in school. But I always used to feel like I tried to be friends with everyone, and, that has its pros and cons too. But again, that struggle when the two things clash and you kind of have to pick which side you want to choose. But again, like I said, there's a lot of transition happening in the show, and this being the last season, they're tying up a lot of loose ends. But I think one of the big issues is there's a lot of time between seasons. Again, the kids are mad older. Even the time between the first and second season was like a year, even in the plot line of the show too. And, it's kind of hard to believe, like, God bless Will, but Noah Schnapp's voice is like mad low right now. And, he just seems older. Again, obviously they're starting to get closer to like university and every high school kid ages. And they're only like 20 or like 19 and shit like that. But again, it's just kind of funny. And, historically speaking, that's how every show's kind of been, right? There's, the cast of fucking Saved by the Bell, none of them were probably actual high school age, right? Because it's hard to find 16-year-olds that are really fucking good at acting. Even Euphoria and all that shit. They're all, maybe you can find one or two cast members that are actually that age and happen to be stud actors. And maybe nowadays you might find that more often. But again, it's hard to find the actual age person. You just have to make them look younger. I think Rick and Morty follows that same thing, not to go off on too big of a tangent, but again, that too much time between seasons, right? You almost lose people's, not like you lose people's interest, but it's just, there's so many shows out there today. And it's so hard to not like, and it's impossible to just constantly be releasing shit. But again, like it's, maybe I'm just, it's a first world problem, that's for sure, that my favorite show, or not that Stranger Things is, but all of a sudden my show isn't on anymore. Like, what am I going to do? All of a sudden I'm going to forget about it? No, I'm going to go find another show. And then when the new season comes out, I'm going to be super excited. So maybe it is, maybe that is something we should be nostalgic about, is, that's what it used to be. You used to have to wait a week at least between shows. And then when the shit went off season, it was off of the season. And then you had to just deal with it, right? Like, patience, man. Patience is a virtue. So anyway, again, like I said, really interesting throwbacks to the show. And in the latest seasons, they've really leaned into kind of Russia as the enemy. And I think this is one of the cool things that I like about the show. And it's what kind of keeps you on your toes from the writers, is that they kind of create plot points, and they create subplots, if you will, or kind of almost like trapdoors or like red herrings here and there, that make you kind of think, oh, like maybe this is like explainable like through real life. And it gives you like a lot of the police officers and the parents in the show are kind of watching, and it gives you their perspective of like, oh, there must be like a real explanation for this. It can't just be like, aliens or like interdimensional supernatural beings that are in different portals and my son's in a wall and shit. Like, again, that's the interesting thing, is that everyone thought Joyce in the first season was nuts. And that's why it's kind of cool, again, as the writers of the show, to actually create plot points, to not just have the townspeople go, oh, you're crazy, that's the only reason why. They actually give them an idea of like, oh, maybe it's the Russians, or maybe it's this and that. So, and again, being in the 80s, it makes sense to kind of use the Russians as an enemy. And they were like, it's obviously Russia and everything, but like clearly Hopper's like in fucking the gulag or something, but they're not really saying like it's in Siberia and shit. But again, that's the cool thing with Hopper and Russia. It gives more depth to the show, and yeah, man, the fourth season's just been really interesting, and just keeps you hooked. As much as you're like, oh man, I'm gonna watch this show and be like, what the, no idea what's even happening, right? So, anyway, one of the kind of brings us to like one of the most interesting, fascinating things I find about not only the series, but specifically season 4, is this Running Up that Hill by Kate Bush. This song that's unbelievable, that is fucking tearing through the charts. It's re-entered the Billboard 100 at number 8, which blew its peak of 30 in 1985 out of the water. So it came back. It might actually even reach number 1. But in the show, they use it as a diegetic piece, which means it's not only heard by the people watching the show, but it's heard by the characters themselves. So in the show, they actually use it. And I think it's such a cool way of doing what they're doing, because in the show there's a demon that's trying to possess these kids, and they use, if they play their favorite song, it kind of allows them to like escape this demon, and it's fucking so cool. And one of the characters, Max, who's amazing, her favorite song is Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. And again, it's really, really cool how they actually use it in the show, because it's just a good metaphor and whatever. But obviously, music is powerful and can take you out of like the darkest places. And, when things are almost all lost. And it's interesting, the Vecna in the show that's actually coming at people and taking their souls or doing whatever they're doing. they actually go after people that have had like trauma, which is also super, super interesting. And it's like, you know, they likened it to like a spider trying to find like the weak prey. And I find that so fascinating about the show, to kind of have the depth like that, right? And to use music as that antidote to try and get out of that. Super cool. And again, I just before this podcast started, finished watching the last episode of the first half of the 4th season, and just tremendous ending. You know, it wasn't, maybe I'm pretty bad at trying to guess like the plot before it's done. And I was kind of, you know, I thought it was interesting when I first figured it out, but I kind of figured out that one dude was probably going to be the dude. But again, like the way they use flashbacks in the show really just kept things fresh. And, you know, it was something that, you know, I never really expected, the finish, right? So again, that's the thing. I don't want to give anything away, and I can't really explain it anyway. But the use of visual effects and everything in the show and everything put together with this music has just been so good. And it's such a catchy fucking song. And it's interesting because the Duffer Brothers actually approached Kate, and she rarely licenses her music out, but she was actually a fan of the show. And so she was happy to give him the rights and everything. And, again, it's so cool that it's given this song like kind of another life, and with streaming and everything, I'm sure it's given Kate a nice little like reboost there. But it's what I find really, really cool about this whole thing, and I think it's the nitty gritty of not only the song, but of the whole show and the whole series, and the phenomenon of what Stranger Things is that, you know, it's fascinating when a new generation can find that magic in the past. And like I said, you know, when I was a kid, I was being introduced to shit from the 60s, and it was interesting, man. It was like it was psychedelic, legit. And that's what was happening in the 60s. And that's what maybe, you know, it's interesting, the things that influence you, right? You know, and as a kid from the 90s, when things were moving in such an interesting direction, and then 2000s were happening, and no one knew what was going to happen with Y2K. And then from 2010 to 2020, nothing seemed to really be as different. You know, it's going to be interesting when we're looking back, because, yeah, you know, the same difference between the 90s and the 60s is the same difference between, you know, the 2020s and the 80s. So it's like, you know, what are we going to do here? Is it going to be, this whole thing where, what are we going to get to when we're in the 2030s? We're going to look back at the early 2000s. Again, not much has changed, right? We have cell phones, we have the internet. You know, things have gotten faster and a little bigger and brighter, or smaller if you're talking about cell phones, or whatever. Or bigger with those, and smaller, and up and down depending on which angle you're looking at. But again, you know, where if you look from the 50s, we're so different from the 60s, we're so different from the 70s, so different from the 80s, right? And it's like, you know, you can look back in the past and be like, wow, there's some things that we did really well, and there's some things that we did really poorly. And again, my advice to anyone is, you know, whatever you're into, whether it's music, whether it's art, whether it's filmmaking, politics, whatever, try and find the people who influence the people that you're interested in. And that will send you on this journey into the past. And, you know, I was talking to this guy, shout out Benny and Kate. I was out at their engagement party, and I was talking to this one dude, and, you know, we're talking about, you know, old school rap and shit like that. And he was like, oh, I'm more into like the new stuff, and saying like how good. And I'm like, that's absolutely cool. But as much as new music is infinite and will constantly being created, and you can be at the cutting edge of that, or like somewhere near there, and you're constantly finding new music. If you go back in the past, you can also do the same thing. And I think that's for everything. I think every artist, every person, everybody who's ever existed has influences and mentors and people that they took from and learned from. And if you're able to find out who those people were, and if you're able to go back and learn about that, and movies and TV shows like Stranger Things can do this for us, right? It's a shortcut, and it kind of gives us this opportunity to be like, wow, this is kind of at least an idea of what life was a little bit like in that scenario. And then when I'm thinking about my influences and thinking about the people that I love and their past influences as well, I can imagine those time periods, right? Because where things are going and with AI and all this stuff, I hope at best, for the best case scenario, that we create something that we're able to accurately look back into our past. And it's not a movie, and it's not something that's romanticized. It's not something that came from someone else's brain. It's somehow not a time machine where we're going back, but at least a machine that we're able to look back into the past and be like, this is exactly what happened. We can see exactly what was said, because that's the problem with history. And that's the problem with things. You know, history is always written by the victor. And when you have people writing shit that it might not be totally accurate, what are you going to do? How can you possibly then create a future based on that rocky ground where you don't know? And that's what happens. And that's why we get into these scenarios where we're fucking making steps backwards, like motherfucking overturning Roe versus Wade, because we forget our history and then people start fucking questioning it. And they go, oh yeah, that's what school taught you, but school is fucking bullshit. Or that's what whatever said to you, but that's patriarchal and they don't know shit. And it comes from this corrupted history of this, that, and this and that. And again, yes, there is a lot of collusion and changing of history, but again, there's a lot of mistakes and people's memories are fallible. No one's memory is fucking perfect. So if we can create a technology where we can then look back in the past and be like, wow, this is exactly what happened. Context, whatever, people who were there, what they look like, how they look. I don't know how. That's going to take an understanding of time in such a different fashion that my mind at least can fucking fathom. We're going to have to be able to go into another dimension, look at time as a physical dimension, which again is hopefully in our close future, but in a future that's so far away that hopefully we don't blow each other up and fight enough wars, and hopefully the earth doesn't, fizzle pop and burn up with this fucking climate change. And, we get to that point, right? Because that's the problem, is that you got to be advanced civilization to do a lot of this shit. And unfortunately, a lot of those advanced civilizations war with each other and kill each other off before they can get anywhere, or natural disasters or whatever. But barring all that, hopefully we can get to a place that this nostalgia and this romanticism actually becomes real and we can use it to our advantage. And we can say, listen, these are the mistakes that we've made and we will never make them again, because the evidence is right there and it's clear as day. And no one's influence on it, no one's interpretation of it or whatever. We're going to understand things just as they were, so then we can move forward in a way to continue to move towards perfection. Maybe we'll never achieve it, and maybe that's what it's all about, but having that goal and moving incrementally towards that, and not taking fucking steps back like we have in the past few days. But not forgetting our past either. Again, that's the most important part. But that's where I'm going to leave everything today. Hopefully the next half of the season is going to be amazing. If you haven't watched it and you've listened to the podcast this far, congratulations. Hopefully I didn't ruin it for you, but go check it out. Again, if you liked what you heard, please give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so you know when we drop the next video. If you ever wanted to drop us a line, check us out on our Twitter, hit us up our DMs at the Bigmark Podcast, or on our Instagram at the Bigmark Pod. If you wanted to donate to the podcast too, we have our Patreon, patreon.com/the Bigmark Pod. There's a couple levels there where you can donate to the podcast depending on how much you want to give. Again, anything is appreciated. We thank you so much. It just keeps the lights on in here, and I love doing this for you. Again, thank you so much for listening. Please tell your friends. Go out there and check out some Stranger Things. Peace.